Robbie's effect on the school was immediate. The older boys let him entirely alone, but the younger ones imitated him in everything, even tearing holes in the knees of their overalls. When they sat in the sun with their backs to the school wall, eating their lunches, Robbie told them about his father and about the sycamore tree. They listened intently and wished their fathers were lazy and gentle too. Sometimes a few of the boys, disobeying orders of their parents, sneaked up to the Maltby place on a Saturday. Junius gravitated naturally to the sycamore limb, and while they sat on both sides of them, he read Treasure Island to them, or described the Gallic Wars, or the Battle of Trafalgar. In no time at all, Robbie, with the backing of his father, became the king of the schoolyard. This is demonstrated by the fact that he had no chum, that they gave him no nickname, and that he arbitrated all the disputes. So exalted was his station that no one even tried to fight with him. Only gradually did Robbie come to realize that he was the leader of the younger boys of the school. Something self-possessed and mature about him made his companions turn to him for leadership. It wasn't long before his was the voice which decided the game to be played. In baseball, he was the umpire, for the reason that no other boy could make a ruling without causing a riot. And while he played the games badly himself, questions of rules and ethics were invariably referred to him. After a lengthy discussion with Junius and Jacob, Robbie invented two vastly popular games, one called Slinky Coyote, a local version of Hare and Hounds, and the other one named Broken Leg, a kind of glorified tag. For these two games, he made rules as he needed them. Miss Morgan's interest was aroused by the little boy, for he was as much a surprise in the schoolroom as he was in the yard. He could read perfectly and used a man's vocabulary, but he could not write. He was familiar with numbers, no matter how large, yet he refused to learn even the simplest arithmetic. Robbie learned to write with the greatest of difficulty. His hand wavered crazy letters on his school pad. At length, Miss Morgan tried to help him. Take one thing and do it over and over until you get it perfectly, she suggested. Be very careful with each letter. Robbie searched his memory for something he liked. At length, he wrote, "There is nothing so monstrous, but we can believe it of ourselves." He loved that monstrous. It gave timber and profundity to the thing. If there were words which through their very sound power could drag unwilling genii from the earth, monstrous was surely one of them. Over and over he wrote the sentence, putting the greatest of care and drawing on his monstrous. At the end of an hour, Miss Morgan came to see how he was getting on. "Why, Robert, where in the world did you hear that?" "It's from Stevenson, ma'am. My father knows it by heart almost." Of course, Miss Morgan had heard all the bad stories of Junius, and in spite of them, had approved of him, but now she had a strong desire to meet him. Games in the schoolyard were beginning to fall off in interest. Robbie lamented the fact to Junius one morning before he started off to school. Junius scratched his beard and thought, "Spy is a good game," he said at last. I remember I used to like Spy." "Well, who shall we spy on, though?" "Oh, anyone. Doesn't matter. We used to spy on the Italians." Robbie ran off excitedly to school, and that afternoon, following a lengthy recourse to the school dictionary, he organized the BASSFEAJ, translated, which it never was, above a whisper. This was the Boys Auxiliary Secret Service for Espionage Against the Japanese. If for no other reason, the very magnificence of the name of the this organization would have made it a force to be reckoned with. One by one, Robbie took the boys into the dim greenness under the schoolyard willow tree, and there swore them to secrecy with an oath so ferocious that it would have done credit to a lodge. Later, he brought the group together. Robbie explained to the boys that we would undoubtedly go to war with Japan someday. It behooves us to be ready, he said. The more we can find out about the nefarious practices of this nefarious race, the more spy information we can give our country when war breaks out. The candidates succumbed before this glorious diction. They were appalled by the seriousness of a situation which required words like these. Since spying was now the business of the school, little Takashi Kato, who was in the 3rd grade, didn't spend a private moment from then on. If Takashi raised 2 fingers in school, Robbie glanced meaningfully at one of the boy auxiliaries, and a second hand sprung fanatically into the air. When Takashi walked home after school, at least 5 boys crept through the brush beside the road. Eventually, however, Mr. Kato, Takashi's father, fired a shot into the dark one night after seeing a white face looking in his window. Robbie reluctantly called the auxiliary together and ordered that the espionage be stopped at sundown. They couldn't do anything really important at night, he explained. In the long run, Takashi did not suffer from the espionage practiced on him, for since the auxiliaries had to watch him, they could make no important excursions without taking him along. He found himself invited everywhere because no one would consent to be left behind to watch him. The boy auxiliaries received their death blow when Takashi, who had in some way learned of their existence, applied for admittance. I don't see how we can let you in, Robbie explained kindly. You see, you're a Japanese, and we hate them. Takashi was almost in tears. I was born here, the same as you, he cried. I'm just as good American as you, ain't I? Robbie thought hard. He didn't want to be cruel to Takashi. Then his brow cleared. Say, do you speak Japanese? He demanded. Sure, pretty good. Well, then you can be our interpreter and figure out secret messages. Takashi beamed with pleasure. Sure, I can, he cried enthusiastically. And if you guys want, we'll spy on my old man. But the thing was broken. There was no one left to fight but Mr. Kato, and Mr. Kato was too nervous with his shotgun. Halloween went past, and Thanksgiving. In that time, Robbie's effect on the boys was indicated by a growth in their vocabularies and by a positive hatred for shoes, or of any kind of good clothing, for that matter. Although he didn't realize it, Robbie had set a style, not new, perhaps, but more rigid than it had been. It was unmanly to wear good clothes, and even more than that, it was considered an insult to Robbie. One Friday afternoon, Robbie wrote 14 notes and secretly passed them to 14 boys in the schoolyard. The notes were all the same. They said, a lot of Indians are going to burn the President of the U.S. to the stake at my house tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Sneak out and bark like a fox down by our lower field. I will come and lead you to the rescue of this poor soul. For several months, Miss Morgan had intended to call upon Junius Maltby. The stories told of him and her contact with his son had raised her interest to a high point. Every now and then, in the schoolroom, one of the boys imparted a piece of astounding information. For example, one child who was really famous for his stupidity told her that Hengist and Horsa invaded Britain. When pressed, he admitted that the information came from Junius Maltby and that in some way it was a kind of a secret. The old story of the goat amused the teacher so much that she wrote it for a magazine, but no magazine bought it. Over and over, she had set a date to walk out to the Maltby farm. She awakened on a December Saturday morning and found frost in the air and a brilliant sun shining. After breakfast, she put on her corduroy skirt and her hiking boots and left the house. In the yard, she tried to persuade the ranch dogs to accompany her, but they only flopped their tails and went back to sleep in the sun. The Maltby place lay about 2 miles away in a little canyon called Gato Amarillo. A stream ran beside the road, and sword ferns grew rankly under the alders. It was almost cold in the canyon, for the sun had not yet climbed over the mountain. Once, during her walk, Miss Morgan thought she heard footsteps and voices ahead of her, but when she hurried around the bend, no one was in sight. However, the brush beside the road crackled mysteriously. Although she had never been there before, Miss Morgan knew the Maltby land when she came to it. Fences reclined tiredly on the ground under an overload of bramble. The fruit trees stretched bare branches clear of a forest of weeds. Wild blackberry vines clambered up the apple trees. Squirrels and rabbits bolted from under her feet, and soft-voiced doves flew away with whistling wings. In a tall wild pear tree, a congress of blue jays squawked a cacophonous argument. Then, beside an elm tree, which wore a shaggy coat of frost-bitten morning glory, Miss Morgan saw the mossy, curled shingles of the Maltby roof. The place, in its quietness, might have been deserted for 100 years. How run down and slovenly, she thought. How utterly lovely and slipshod. She let herself into the yard through a wicket gate, which hung to its post by one iron band. The farm buildings were gray with weathering, and up the sides of the walls, outlawed climbers pushed their fingers. Miss Morgan turned the corner of the house and stopped in her tracks. Her mouth fell open, and a chill shriveled on her spine. In the center of the yard, a stout post was set up, and to it an old and ragged man was bound with many lengths of rope. Another man, younger and smaller but even more ragged, piled brush about the feet of the captive. Miss Morgan shivered and backed around the house corner again. "Such things don't happen," she insisted. "You're dreaming. Such things can't happen." And then she heard the most amiable of conversations going on between the two men. "It's nearly 10, said the torturer. The captive replied, "Yes, and you be careful how you put fire to that brush. You be sure to see them coming before you light it." Miss Morgan nearly screamed with relief. She walked a little unsteadily towards the stake. The free man turned and saw her. For a second he seemed surprised, but immediately recovering, he bowed. Coming from a man with torn overalls and a matted beard, the bow was ridiculous and charming. "I'm the teacher," Miss Morgan explained breathlessly. "I was just out for a walk and I saw this house. For a moment I thought this auto de fe was serious." Junius smiled. "But it is serious. It's more serious than you think. For a moment I thought you were the rescue. The relief is due at 10 o'clock.